All right, we are recording, and my name is Jennifer West. I'm the artistic director of Muzewest Concerts, and it is my pleasure to have this extremely wonderful panel of pianists here with us today. And the person who I see on my left is Chen, and Sean is coming to us from where today?
Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City, Missouri. And on my right, I see Henry Kramer. Where are you coming to us from today?
Columbus, Georgia.
Columbus, Georgia. And in the middle row, this is like tic-tac-toe. In the middle row right below me, I see Asiya. Where are you coming to us from today?
I'm in Boston, Massachusetts.
Boston, Massachusetts. Right on. And beside Asiya, I see Michelle Powell. Where are you coming to us from today?
The Netherlands.
The Netherlands. And last person in the middle row, I see Frank Huang. Frank, where are you coming to us from?
Oxford, Ohio.
Oxford, Ohio. Frank, can you greet our Mandarin speakers in Vancouver?
Oh, I would not want to embarrass my Chinese, so but nice to see you and welcome all of you guys here.
Sean, would you like to give a quick Mandarin greeting?
大家好，谢谢你们听我们说话。
Thank you, Sean. And in the bottom row, we have Daniel Shapiro. Where are you coming to us from today, sir?
Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland Heights, Ohio, to be precise.
Cleveland Heights, Ohio, to be precise. And we have, last but definitely not least, David Kaplan. Where are you coming to us from today?
New York, New York.
New York, New York, my favorite city in the world. And how are things in New York? Is it improving?
The numbers seem to suggest improvement, so we can be thankful to the medical workers primarily.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have to ask, because all musician friends that I know live in one area of New York. Are you also in the Washington Heights sort of area-ish?
I am, yeah.
Okay. So I was staying with a friend who lived in Washington Heights, and he told me at 9 o'clock, you're going to hear someone playing Chopin Opus 10. And I said, well, oh, who's that? And he's like, it's Washington Heights. Somebody in the building has a piano.
That's true.
It's very true. Let's get started. And I'm going to throw this question to Henry. Henry, what's the first word that comes to your mind when I say Beethoven piano sonatas?
Life. Yes. Yeah. Honestly, that was the first word that just came to my mind. Yeah, I would say life, just because they encompass so millions of emotions. And yeah.
That's wonderful. Does anybody else have one word that comes to mind when I say Beethoven piano sonatas?
I would say structure. Extraordinary variety of structure as well. I truly appreciate the constructive abilities in Beethoven, and I think this is one of the features. He hugely influenced everybody after him. So I cannot take the word that Henry already used, but I think other than just the spirit of life, the structure is probably the secondary most important thing that comes to mind.
I agree. Anybody else have a one word or one thought that comes to mind when I say Beethoven piano sonatas?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off of what Henry was saying, maybe journey. I would go with journey, or if you want to cheap, lifelong journey. And I think, we start from the beginning sonatas to the end. He drastically changes his compositional style because politically, personally, socially, everything that has changed. And I just see that, and it's an evolution of style, of his creative spirit and energy, and it's so incredibly embodies the humanistic spirit. I mean, we look at 111, we look at the lyricism in 110, and we look at all the kind of torment and anguish in the middle period with the big war horses like Opus 53 and 57. So it's a lifelong journey. Anyways, I'll hush.
Wonderful. I'm going to move on to my next sort of topic. Michelle, you teach a lot in the Netherlands. And you teach and perform a lot in the Netherlands. And I'm wondering if you were going to send a student, and Daniel, you're going to get this question next too. If you were going to send a student to listen to any complete set of Beethoven sonata recordings, to whom would you recommend them to listen, and why that version?
Oh my God.
Too much pressure. Too much pressure. I love Brendel because of the clarity, articulation. I mean, just his whole conception of I don't know. Every time I listen to him, I feel like I get a new understanding of how the form should be. I'm someone who's like, I'm much more a detailed person than the overall form structure. So it's really helpful for me to listen to interpretations where I can kind of sense like the overall architecture of a piece. And I find with his playing, I can really get in like an overall view of how the piece is rather than getting stuck in the specific notes, if that makes sense.
And Daniel, you have been teaching at the Cleveland Institute of Music, and I was lucky enough to have a lesson with you when you came to play in Vancouver. And you're just a fantastic teacher and performer. And so I'm really curious, when you assign a Beethoven sonata to your students, or they come to you wanting to learn a sonata, whose recordings do you recommend?
Well, actually, I tell them not to listen to any recordings at all, as a matter of fact. I tell them for any composer, they should study the music itself and build that relationship between score and performer, because there are great artists who have made bad recordings or and so on and so forth, and one is unconsciously, influenced in some way by listening to somebody else play, and one should develop one's own train of thought. Having said that, overall, I would probably send my students to listen to Arthur Schnabel, because I feel that he was one of the greatest Beethoven players, and one may quibble with this detail or that detail, but the essential spirit of Beethoven is there, I think, for me in his playing more than anybody. And when you listen to his playing, you feel stimulated and ennobled, and you feel wiser, and you feel more like a human being. And I think that's what Beethoven was after.
I agree. David, growing up, were there recordings of Beethoven you listened to that you now recommend to your students?
Well, Professor Shapiro stole my
Stole your thunder.
The reason why I think, reasonable to suspect that a number of us on this panel, if not broadly, would go for Schnabel's. And I mean, he was, his influence can't be underestimated, if for no other reason than that he was the first as a group, and he was also one of the major pianists to make his own edition. I think for the better part of half a century was the one that most serious people would learn from. So it was really his ideas. It's a very detailed edition. I'm sure people here are familiar with it, with just very poetic instructions, really in the spirit of, for instance, like the edition of the Bach Preludes and Fugues that's published by Busoni in the late 19th century. Totally, utterly polemical, his own subjective personal viewpoint, and no apology about that.
That's wonderful. My next question is for Sean. So Sean, before we dive into how piano music changed after Beethoven, what are some of his innovations to piano writing?
You're asking me that because when you were asking about the one word, and I was thinking evolution, and then Frank said it, so I agree wholeheartedly with him about that. And I think we're so used to hearing Beethoven sonatas that we hear 111, we hear Moonlight, we hear Appassionata, and we go, okay, we've heard it 5 million times, it seems normal. But if you think about it, if you look at the music, if you really compare what he wrote versus what was being written at the time, it's like so I mean, shocking in a way what he does with not only the things that shock us now, like registration, dissonances, but even just form, like Asiya was talking about, just weird experimentation form. Opus 27 number 1 starts off with a variation rondo thing, and things like that. So I think those are, some of the innovations are in his experimentation of form and structure and pushing the boundaries there. I think pianistically, what he had in a way that modern composers don't have is an ever-changing instrument. I mean, the piano was still changing at the time during his life. And so every time something new came out, he could, write some new sonorities or new registers and new ranges on the piano. So for example, in Opus 101, when he hits that low E, he's really happy about it. He writes contra E at the bottom. And so, things like that I think we don't really benefit from. We have a piano that's stayed the same for over 100 years now, pretty much. And so we're used to it. But I think that's one of the cool things is going through Beethoven's sonatas and kind of seeing at what point he discovers something new in terms of the piano sonority and how he puts it into his sonatas.
That's so true. And I think as pianists, we're just so lucky to have a survey of his complete compositional life from beginning with the F minor dedicated to Haydn all the way to Opus 111, which certainly must be the closest to an ascent to heaven that we can hear. So we're so lucky to have that. Now, our panelists are really exceptional performers who have been on international stages, and the number of countries that all of them have performed in is so numerous. So I have a really funny, awkward, embarrassing question. Do any of you have any funny stories or harrowing tales of playing a Beethoven sonata under duress, or any funny story about playing Beethoven that the audience might get a good chuckle from? Or well, students?
I personally try not to be under duress for any performance, but
no funny Beethoven sonata stories?
Well, if you will,
they're never funny when to us.
If you will allow a piece that's not a sonata, I can tell a story about Emperor Concerto.
Yes, go ahead.
And you can go and listen to the YouTube video. You can hear it. They're in the Clyburn finals. Played Emperor, and in development, the orchestra goes da ba da ba ba da, and then the pianist comes in with the chromatic scale. And I came in, I think, a beat early or half a beat early, and I get to the top of the chromatic scale. I'm like, oh, they're not done yet. So I just repeated the top of the chromatic scale one more time, and I was like, okay, now I'm there. So
that's the mark of a true virtuoso.
Well,
yeah.
It's sort of a adapt and overcome kind of thing.
It is. And actually, that's the first time that I heard Sean, not the actual concerto performance, but was in the Clyburn of 2013. And it was an interesting time. My grandmother had just passed away, and it was in June, and the Clyburn was wrapping up, and I'd been watching and following. And Sean's performance of Bach, Sean, I think you played either a partita or French suite. And it just
French suite.
And it just really kind of was part of the healing process. And my cousins were listening along too, and they thought, oh, this music thing, it's not so bad after all. All right.
Well, if I can talk, I mean, we're talking about Beethoven. I think for him, music was, he was creating, but it was also healing for him. And especially after he found out his was going, we all know about the Heiligenstadt test or continue.
I was just gonna say, going on that idea, connecting it back to Beethoven's piano writing, I think, as Sean said, part of it is the instruments were changing, but I think it's also the spirit of the music is, I don't think before him we really have a composer who's transcending the idiom the way Beethoven does with the piano, like kind of a disregard for the instrument and the performer in the service of what the ideal of the music is. And I think for me, when I play Beethoven, I feel that physicality and the awkwardness of it. And I think, even specifically, you could look at the different varieties of Alberti basses he comes up with. It's so varied.
They are excruciating.
Yeah, and excruciatingly difficult. I'm thinking immediately of the ending of the first movement of a fourth cello sonata. But and I think part of the way the music feels and that kind of relationship to the instrument goes into the expression. Like when you hear Beethoven, that sounds effortless the way we would maybe want to hear Chopin played. It somehow is missing that feeling of pushing beyond the purely physical realm that the music is produced in.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have some people on this panel who are transcribing music a lot. So I want to throw this out to Asiya first. So my question is, what are some examples of pieces that are directly influenced by Beethoven? Any transcriptions? And why are these works important in and of themselves? And I know Asiya's been transcribing and Sean too, and I'm going to throw this to Asiya first, and then they can kind of bounce back about the transcription topic.
One, to me, when I think about the genre of transcription, and it's been like this my entire life for me, I think of Liszt transcriptions of Beethoven symphonies. And I just thought that the concept of Beethoven really, really stretching the abilities of what can be done on the instrument and expanding that, and then Liszt taking over and expanding it further, and now representing not just like a completely new era of pianism and playing and abilities on the piano, but okay, now we're jumping from just doing the purely piano pieces. Now we're replicating an orchestra on the instrument. And so the work that Liszt done on Beethoven symphonies, and not just Beethoven symphonies and other symphonic works as well, really opened a new door to the whole genre of not only I'm playing like a nice folk tune with accompaniment, or I'm transcribing a little song from a song setting, like a vocal setting, to the solo setting, but now I'm just taking a whole orchestral piece and just merging it and blending it to fit my hands. And in this regard, it is difficult for me to pinpoint like one piece that was influenced by that, because it's just the whole thing. I think if I've never knew that Liszt transcribed Beethoven symphonies for piano, I would never think of like, I don't know, I'm right now working on Manfred Symphony by Tchaikovsky, and I'm referencing Liszt's work a lot in that. And when you think about Ninth Symphony of Beethoven and the range it represents, and still thinking, okay, there was one dude who actually fit in the two hands, well, then that means Bach can probably dare to do something like that too. So, yeah, it's a whole genre, I guess.
That's wonderful. Sean, you... We'll get Sean to unmute.
I'm a big admirer of Sean's transcriptions, by the way.
Yes, Sean, your Symphony No. 9 transcription is recently recorded. I believe it was at a performance at St. Olaf's.
Uh-huh.
And you also were recently live with that on Facebook.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your process for that transcription? It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. No, so because of Liszt's, big influence in transcriptions, any transcriptions, whenever, and I agree with us, anytime I do a transcription, I'm at least thinking of, if not actually looking at how he's doing certain passages. You can hear the orchestra version, and you can see what he's doing to try to recreate that effect. So I read the Liszt version first because I was asked to play the Liszt version. And so my theory is, any audience member nowadays has heard Beethoven 9 more than Liszt ever heard in his life. I mean, we hear it every year, multiple times, not to mention recordings and things like that. So we, in a way, have a better idea of how it sounds, I think, than Liszt did. I mean, even if you didn't study the score, if you're just a casual listener, I think you know the piece better than Liszt knew sonically, not compositionally. I think so that's one consideration. Second consideration is there has been scholarship done since Liszt that have uncovered certain performance indications and things like that by Beethoven that weren't in the publications at that time. So some doublings are not in the list version, which are in modern editions and things like that, some note discrepancies. So there's that. And the third is he actually made the last movement of the Ninth Symphony transcription later than the first three movements. And you can actually tell if you play through it, the style of transcription is different. It's, in my opinion, less maximal than the first three movements. First three movements, he kind of, it's like the Tannhäuser Overture. He puts everything in there, all the doublings and all the, it's really, really kind of amazing. And somehow when he gets to the fourth movement, he kind of, it's almost like when we talk about late style of composers, they kind of actually go away. They parse it down and it's a little bit simpler and they leave out stuff they don't really need. And for me, when I played through it, I felt actually like a lot of stuff that I was listening for was missing, or he was bringing out some of the voices that I didn't actually expect him to bring out. So my purpose in making my arrangement was just to bring it more in line with what I am used to hearing, whether that's what Beethoven actually heard or thought of when he wrote his pieces. In a way, not something that we should try to figure out. We should just go with what we're used to hearing and try to translate that to the piano. That's my kind of philosophy for transcription, is almost like playing by ear, trying to transcribe this way, orally. So that's my spiel about transcription.
And to our audience, if you have not heard Sean's transcription of the last movement of the Ninth Symphony, make your day better, make your week better, make your month better. Go listen to it. It is phenomenal. Now, the next question that I have, I'm going to preface with a little anecdote. In 2017, I was on vacation for spring break in Southern California, beautiful SoCal. And a friend of mine that I was visiting was studying at the University of Southern California with Jeffrey Kahane. And my friend texted me and said, "Do you want to come to studio class? You can meet my professor." And I was like, that's scarier than meeting parents, but sure, I'll come along. So there I was, off to studio class of Jeffrey Kahane. I had no business being in this room with these people. Like, I wanted to go to Disneyland. So I ended up going to the class and he's like, "Oh, you must be the Canadian." I'm like, yes, that's one of my labels. So the first performance was a sonata by Beethoven I hadn't heard yet. And I've listened to quite a bit of music for my nonprofit work and just as a piano teacher. And the performer played Opus 78 and I just wept. And I had never heard something so exquisite. And, Professor Kahane's comments after were just so gentle. And he just thanked the person for sharing that day because there was really nothing constructive to say. It was like, thank you for sharing how to play Beethoven. And so that was the first time I heard a sonata by Beethoven that I hadn't heard before. And it really struck me because we all grow up hearing Moonlight, Appassionata, Pathétique, 109, 110, 111. We all grew up hearing these. So my question, maybe I'll throw this to Michelle. Michelle, what's your underappreciated or underplayed sonata by Beethoven that you think the world should hear?
I don't know. The first thing that comes to mind is, well, I don't know, maybe you've all heard this 1,000 times, but 10-3 for me, I mean, the opening, I learned it when I was younger, and I think it was my first introduction to kind of, I love that word that Henry used, life. And I think the spirit of Beethoven, it was the first time I really grasped the possibilities, I think, in hearing that opening. So maybe it's not the best. I mean, I don't really know how you can choose. I think as everyone here is explaining, like all of the sonatas bring something different to the element of Beethoven. Like it's a huge mosaic of who he is. And that's only, of course, one element of his work. Of course, that's not even talking about his orchestral works. So yeah, for me, that's what comes to mind. Just the joy of that opening phrase and thinking like, wow, this is the spark of possibility.
That's wonderful. Henry, why do you think Moonlight, Appassionata, and Pathétique have kept their popularity for so long? What is it about these that keeps us entranced?
They have titles. I'm actually half joking, but I think the publishers knew what they were doing by giving pieces titles. Because I don't think there's any reason one is better than another. If we take Beethoven sonatas, like you just said, Opus 78 doesn't have a title, but it could be an equally wonderful piece. I mean, popular piece in the zeitgeist that still lives on today. But I think also people love a finale, and those sonatas really deliver in that way. The way they're structured really weights the excitement toward the end of the piece. So, that could be something that people just respond to, the kind of raw rhythmic power that we get with those sonatas. I'm not talking, of course, about Pathétique here, but maybe in the first movement, that kind of quiet intensity that is, the face of Beethoven, I think, in popular conception of who he was as a person,
I would like to add also that Waldstein sonata, at least in Russia, we grow up. We know that sonata not as Waldstein sonata, we know that sonata as Aurora. We call that sonata Aurora, and it represents the rising sun in the last movement, and kind of like twilight in the middle section, little movement. And it also makes perfect sense, and it very, very much supports the idea that, titles mean a lot, because everybody's just like, oh, Aurora. Oh my God. Which, exactly as Jennifer was saying, there are other sonatas who are capable of capturing us immediately and really, really touching us very deeply, but somehow they are on a little bit kind of behind these few, because they don't have really exact titles, and it's much more difficult for people to describe it. Just like, this sonata, Opus 78. Like not everybody would be able to describe it this way.
Could be Aurora too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Definitely.
Just a quicker one.
Yeah.
I wanted to send our next question to Daniel Shapiro. Daniel, you've done a lot of work on Brahms and Schubert lately. And so our conversation was initially going to be about the shadow of Beethoven. And we haven't talked about the composers after Beethoven, which kind of indicates to me that my thesis about him having a big shadow is true. But Daniel, can you talk about how Schubert and Brahms are both influenced by Beethoven?
Well, they both, of course, worshipped him. And Schubert, there are many famous quotes from Schubert about the greatness of Beethoven. And Brahms sort of felt the weight of Beethoven on his shoulders. And there's the famous story of why it took him so long to write his first symphony, because he felt that weight of Beethoven. And to write a symphony that could stand alongside Beethoven's was a huge challenge for him. But I think, especially for Brahms, just such mastery of form, to use a synonym of what Asiya used, or structure or architecture. It took Brahms, was striving all his life to work in that dimension. And of course, Beethoven was alive for most of Schubert's life, and so Schubert really felt the weight of the gravitational pull of Beethoven. But yet Schubert managed to find his own completely different voice. I mean, you see traces of Beethoven's influence, and even some modeling certain forms of Beethoven. It's been said that the last movement of the D959 sonata is loosely based on the last movement of Opus 31, number 1. That kind of thing. So Schubert was deeply. They were both composers who were deeply in awe of Beethoven, and carried that as a weight on their shoulders for their entire lives.
Thank you. David, I have a question for you. Does Beethoven actually leave a shadow, or is this a myth perpetuated in music history? Like, is there a real shadow, or did people do stuff after Beethoven? I mean, it sounds like a silly question, but maybe this is up for debate. Like, you know, we talk about, oh, what could happen after the Ninth Symphony? Even Brahms, like Daniel commented, Brahms said, well, I'm having trouble writing the 10th. Like, is this a real thing?
Oh, unmute.
There you go. Oh, I think he might still be muted. We're gonna wait one moment for David to have some sound connected. No problem. Frank, what do you think?
I absolutely agree with what Daniel just said about, I do believe, you know, especially in the 19th century, composers were having increasing amount of pressure to, you know, to identify with the musical tradition, but also forge their own path, you know, and I think Brahms was a great example of that. I think there's a quote that I discovered recently about how Brahms said to a bunch of close friends in a private meeting, he said, you know, gentlemen, I know I'm not Beethoven, but I am Brahms. I'm Johannes Brahms. And I really believe he felt that pressure with the famous Beethoven's 10th Symphony. You know, that famous story how they, you know, someone said, oh, the last movement of your symphony sounds very similar to Ode to Joy. And then he was very sensitive and snarky about it, actually, you know. So, any ass can see that, you know, and I'm just like, geez, you know, but I really do believe that a lot of composers and musicians following Beethoven really had that kind of pressure. So, I mean, they all found their own way. I agree, Schubert went his own different way, but they both admired and respected Beethoven so much. We know Brahms in his collection, he collected so much music of all of his Germanic predecessors. So I do believe that Beethoven overshadowed a lot of the composers, particularly in the 19th century.
To me, if I may add one thing, to me, it is almost funny how Beethoven's forms and Beethoven's ideas influenced so many people. And people who showed the influence, such as Brahms did to a certain extent, they firstly showed the influence in terms of keeping that tradition, keeping that form, keeping that integrity of all the elements. But Beethoven, if you look at him, he was somebody who was breaking out of these traditions constantly. He was constantly breaking. People who were influenced, they were picking up mostly on the unified structural part in him, because you know, Brahms was, for example, a person who, you know, despised bicycles because they're representing too much of innovation for him, and he didn't like anything modern, anything that's like novelty or any development that signals of a new time. He kind of wanted to really be in the past, and he, to me, kind of tried to stay in that area that somewhere in the back of his head was represented by Beethoven, and just dig deeper, but not necessarily dig out of that area, or you can call it.
I don't know. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, please. You go ahead.
David, you were going to say something?
Oh, yes, but I'm not sure. Oh, now you can hear me. Okay, good. Sorry about that. I just responding to what you had asked, Jennifer. You know, and this of course rides on what many of you have already said, but the figure that Beethoven reminds me most of in sort of general cultural history is Shakespeare. And of course, Beethoven was a big fan of Shakespeare. You might well ask the same question. One might well ask the same question of, is theater possible, or is literature possible after Shakespeare? And of course, the answer is yes. But if I think about what makes Shakespeare so amazing and what makes him such a shadow, it's that his plays have unity of action. They're about one thing, but they somehow also are about everything. You know, that there's a character or a line in every Shakespeare play that somehow covers every kind of shade of human existence. I really associate that with Beethoven as well. You know, that Asiya was talking about the constructive element of Beethoven, the unity, and that's what appealed to Brahms, but he just had so much breadth as well. I'm not even sure that composers after Beethoven have been bold enough to attempt to have that combination of breadth and specificity. I mean, so few composers even try, you know. I think that's maybe what makes the shadow appear longer than perhaps equally great composers who aren't as intimidating.
I love the comparison to literature, because I think that's something that doesn't happen enough, is that in music, we kind of stay in our discipline a lot, and getting interdisciplinary and moving beyond the confines of our musical language. So when you said Shakespeare, can there be theater after Shakespeare? I was instantly like, oh, that's the analogy, that's the parallel right there. I just want to open it up to one last topic, because we think about Beethoven's chamber music as well. Does anybody want to comment on how Beethoven changed piano writing for chamber music?
I could start.
Henry.
If that's okay.
Go for it.
I think, immediately, when you look at, for instance, the violin sonatas, these are sonatas for pianoforte and violin, and the piano parts have much greater scope, much more expressivity, I think, and play a multitude of roles. And I think Beethoven is maybe continuing where Mozart might have left the door open in specifically the violin sonatas. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, because I'm glad you brought up chamber music in the violin sonata specifically, because you said one of the topics was misconceptions about Beethoven. And I think one of them is that he's purely instrumental in like the continuation of Haydn. But if we look at the violin sonatas, there's really an operatic component, especially in the slow movements, that I think is underappreciated in Beethoven and actually unlocks a lot of the expressivity and the kind of expression one needs to play that music. And that was a real revelation for me when I was studying these pieces.
Anybody else want to talk about Beethoven's piano writing for chamber music?
I might,
yes.
In a sense, when Beethoven writes a piano sonata, it's true there are operatic elements also, but he's writing a kind of symphony for the piano. And you really feel the sense of the whole orchestra and perhaps singers as well. And then when he writes chamber music, just the responsibility of that orchestra is just divided up into 2 people or 3 people, but you still feel more than the 1 or 2 or 3 instruments that are being played. There's a kind of a cosmos of sound and richness.
That's wonderful. And I know that we were supposed to have the Toronto Symphony concertmaster Jonathan Crowe come to play the complete Beethoven sonatas for us with wonderful Montreal-based pianist Philip Chu, and that was canceled, of course, due to this health crisis. But as we were advertising it, Professor Jane Coop got on my case for not putting piano and violin. So in the description, I got in big trouble. So I think another aspect of Beethoven's chamber music writing is that the role of the piano is certainly not accompaniment. It has accompaniment passages, but certainly the number of notes that we have and the prominence of that role has changed as well. And we're talking about opera, and I was just thinking about why Fidelio isn't so popular, and why Beethoven didn't become an opera composer as such. But having heard all of you kind of comment that there are operatic and vocal elements in the instrumental music, I guess that kind of answers our question a bit, because that has been one thing I'm curious about for a long time. Is Mozart's opera is hugely successful. And I just wondered why Beethoven didn't get that same success.
I don't think he had the same financial impetus as other composers, because opera was an extremely lucrative field. And Beethoven was one of the first composers to have like full sponsorship, and had wonderful donors who said, "Okay, we're gonna give you a salary to just compose." And I think that he turned inward, and that's how we got the late string quartets and the late piano sonatas, and it's more, opera was very kind of socially a public thing, and I don't know, but that is an interesting question.
Well,
maybe that's one reason.
The one other aspect of that is that in Vienna, the public taste towards opera veered very sharply away from Beethoven's style of writing, and during his lifetime. So the rise of popularity of Rossini and the sort of coming on of the Biedermeier period did not spell, that was not particularly inviting to Beethoven. So that's another aspect of it too. And I mean, what you say, Henry, I feel is incredibly, is right on the money in terms of his unique status in early 19th century, being the first guy to be able to do whatever he wanted. But there's also that taste element too.
It's true.
And there's a third aspect to that, same as, every major violinist, and not major as well, is playing Beethoven violin concerto these days. But at the time of writing, there were certain passages and certain lines that were considered unplayable or unhumane. And that's true about certain lines in the final movement of the Ninth Symphony for the vocalists. It is that situation that when something, it doesn't sound as difficult as it is, when it's just awkward for the mechanism of the voice. And the same applies to a lot of parts in the Fidelio opera. And I think that was also influential, other than just the heroic theme of the opera that was definitely getting out of fashion at the time. It was just like too difficult.
That's
the
true.
singers aren't as masochistic as pianists.
No, I mean, it's important to remember that Beethoven never heard, a performance of one of his sonatas in his own lifetime. That the whole idea of a public concert was foreign, and nothing to do with the contemporary musical culture. So everything that we've been saying about how the sonatas have symphonic scope is all the more amazing because it's imbuing that private space that's inside the player and inside the home with that grandeur.
This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I want to close by inviting Sean to transcribe some of those late quartets. Please.
Well, there is the Beethoven's own transcription of the Grosse Fuge for piano four hands, which is very hard, very difficult. And part of the difficulty is just getting out of the way of each other. It's like playing Twister on the piano, basically.
Oh, that's
It's a fantastic version of it to play.
I just wanted to mention that a lot of people on this panel are doing live stream concerts for us coming up in the month of May and June. So Sean is, Asiya and David and Michelle. So we're gonna get those dates coming out to you. And I wanted to give this opportunity to any of our panelists to say if you have any upcoming online events we should follow. Anybody have something coming up they want to announce that people can check out?
Well, I have an event on Saturday, May 2nd. I am performing for the concert series in Vashon, where I was supposed to play a live normal concert, but we're switching to the live stream, and I'm doing a video concert for them on Saturday. And I'm playing Beethoven Heroic Variations as an opening piece. So.
Oh, I've been playing that this year. It's one of the hardest things I have to play by Beethoven.
It's amazing.
I have a question.
Very, very
But
hard.
I think it was Henry that was talking about how I think this piece exemplifies how Beethoven just did not care about about the pianist. It
Yes.
was just like the sorry, I'm so passionate about this because it's after the fugue, after all of the finger busting that he does.
Yeah, and now you're like in the eggshells completely.
Yes, but that's the hardest part in the entire piece. It's after the fugue, in my opinion. But anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, I have a very, very important question. Has everybody been learning to tune their own piano?
I did a little bit. I do a little bit, but I'm not very successful.
Actually, I have a
looked it up.
roommate. Oh.
Great, totally.
My roommate is a piano technician, so I win at life.
Oh, no!
That's very nice.
No, I feel just dreadfully sorry for anybody. I feel so sorry for anybody who has to listen to my piano, if not the pianist. Online.
Me too. Me too. It's so terribly out of tune.
Just feel the vibrations like Beethoven. You know?
That's right.
Inception.
I was doing an ear training test with one of my students and asking them to identify an interval or something, and they got it wrong. And they said, well, your piano's out of tune, Miss Jennifer. I have perfect pitch. And I was like,
Oh, burn.
Booyah.
oh,
Then you should make them identify in quarter tones and quarter.
yes,
Quarters like
exactly.
What the interval is, please?
this.
Well, I hope one day that all of these people that we see on the screen can meet for dinner in one of the wonderful cities in the world and talk about in real life and talk about music and have a nice bottle or 3 of wine.
Five.
I said 3. We'll go with 3. So it's been such a pleasure, and I think this is a testament to Beethoven's music that we have people from all corners of the United States, a lonely Canadian polar bear, and a Canadian in exile in the Netherlands. I guess it's not exile, but the fact that expat, yes, very different things, as we just had Passover. But it's a testament to the power of Beethoven's music that this brings us together for such a rich, warm, entertaining, and enlightening discussion. I think one of my favorite moments was when Henry said, "It's because they have titles." I'm taking that with me. If someone can take a screenshot of us all.
I just did.
Did
Did
you?
it.
Could you send that to me, please?
Of course I will. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I want everyone to give us a virtual round of applause for this wonderful discussion.
Hey, great to meet everybody who I haven't met in person yet.
Yes.
This was really fun.
This was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank
Thanks
you
for organizing this.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
great to meet everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you to this fellow.
Yay.
So I wish all of you a quick return.
Okay, let's do it.
Yes, oh, Henry,
I don't make
It's all the
any
Henry
sense.
Here.
I don't have my Beethoven.
Nice try.
I wish all of you the very best health, and I wish all of you a return to completely packed concert halls. Thank you for.
I'll even take empty ones, empty ones.
I hear that David will take empty halls. But just a reminder to everybody to sign up for your online concert if you haven't already. And we're really excited for that. And David, you have a concert tonight with your wife.
Yes. Well, we already played it, but it will be broadcast tonight. Yeah.
Broadcast tonight. Where can we listen to that?
I think on the usual places, but the show, it's called Living Music Show, hosted by Nadia Sirota.
So you're going to be playing composers that aren't dead?
No, it's a very, heart still beating.
Whoa.
A composer named Timo Andrus. It's a piece for flute and piano that he wrote for us, and so we're playing that. And I think Alan Pearson and Alarm Will Sound are doing some John Luther Adams. And it's a really fun show, actually. And my wife is going to make the Sydney Opera House out of a napkin, so that you don't want to miss.
Okay.
Wow.
I'm there.
That's
Definitely.
wonderful.
You said Sydney Opera House out of napkins?
Yep.
Very nice.
This is wonderful. I hope to see all of you in person within the next couple years. And thank you so much for your generosity of spirit and time. This was way too much fun. So from Vienna or not, thank you to you all, and stay safe and have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye, ciao.
Ciao.